Is the dollar going to crash? Are we about to see an end to the petrodollar system? Hi, I'm Rod Saunders from Jew and Greek, and in today's episode of the Rod and Staff podcast, we're going to be discussing the history of money, the fiat currency system, the gold standard, and Bretton Woods, and the petrodollar system, and where we are today. There's a lot of misinformation out there that is directed at the Christian community. So I think we owe it to ourselves and to the kingdom of God to be knowledgeable so that we're not easily susceptible to hype, misinformation, and scam artists. So stay tuned, and I think you're going to find this very informative.
Well, hello again, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Rod and Staff podcast. I'm Rod Saunders from Jew and Greek, and joining me today is my partner in crime and my best friend, Marcus Curtis. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, everyone.
Marcus and I, just to give you a little background, about 12, 13 years ago, we both were involved in exposing an investment scam called the Iraqi dinar scam. And we were both blogging, and Marcus ended up writing a book. If you want to show the book there real quick,
Sure.
that you got handy. This book, The Coming Global Currency Reset, was a result of the research that Marcus did originally in debunking the scam. And eventually it led him into a whole new study of currency, the gold standard, the petrodollar, and all of this stuff that we're going to be talking about tonight. So if you want to check out his blog, it's still up, I believe, IraqCurrencyWatch.com. I don't think he's added anything to it in years, but input from both of us on that blog. I am known as Sam I Am. I didn't want to expose my name because I made a lot of people mad. But anyway, all the research and the articles are still out there. And Marcus has continued to do research, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, Marcus, if you could just start off a little bit with the history of currency and how you ended up doing transactions with paper currency, and how we ended up on the gold standard, and why we went off the gold standard.
Sure.
If you can wrap that up in about 10, 15 minutes.
Sure, I'll do my best. But I also want to say that Iraq Currency Watch also has a YouTube channel, which we haven't made any videos for that channel in a long time. At one point, that website was getting 25,000 hits a month. And when you start telling the truth, that dwindled down, and people figured out they weren't going to make any money after like 1,000 hits a month or something. So people had a hard time accepting the data and the facts that we presented. But okay, so
it's a lot like debunking heretic hunters.
Right.
People don't want to hear the truth sometimes, right. So it's not as marketable. But go ahead.
Yeah, agenda driven. So okay, so we know in the Bible, when we look in the Bible, they've used gold and silver. Gold was the king's metal. Silver was the metal of the people. And we see examples of this throughout the Old Testament. It was Abraham purchased a tomb for his wife Sarah, and he used silver, and he measured out the silver using scales. And so he used the silver to buy this tomb. And back then, gold and silver were the metals that were used for exchange, replaced a barter system basically. And scales had to be used. And it was a Greek historian, Herodias, and he was writing in the 5th century BC. The Lydian people were the first people to have used gold and silver coinage, I believe. But the actual truth, I think, is the earliest coins are from parts of modern Turkey and parts of the ancient kingdom of Lydia. And these coins were first produced in the 7th century BC, and it only had a design on one side, and the exact unit of weight was in the coin itself. So that was the great invention of the coin. So scales were no longer needed with the coins. The earlier coins were a mixture of other metals, but in the time of Lydia, separated the metals of silver and the gold coins, and it was called electrum. Okay, that was what the metal they used. And when the Jews started to make coins that weighed, each coin was 1 shekel. 1 unit of weight was a shekel. So that's where the coins came. And when they came on the scene, they exploded in use. Everybody used them. And when you get to the time of the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire used coins, and they had silver. And what they did was they wanted to introduce more silver. So what they did is they made the coins out of other metals and just coated it with silver. So you get into the 3rd century of Rome, it only had 5% of silver on the outside of the coin, and that sort of wore off. But they found out that when they introduced more coins into circulation, they got this inflation that happened because they introduced more money into the supply. So as time went on, you have the goldsmiths, and the goldsmiths, their job was to purify gold because gold and silver were money, basically. And so what they would do is they would make sure that they'd heat it up and boil it down and get all the impurities out, and they would make sure that this gold was suitable for exchange. And so these goldsmiths, they had these huge vaults. And what would happen is people who own gold, they would go to these goldsmiths and they would want to keep the gold in their vault because they had the best vaults. So what the goldsmiths did is they took their gold and they wrote them a receipt. And in the process of writing this receipt, they took that gold and put it in their vault for safekeeping. Well, these people began to realize that when they traded the receipts, it was easier to trade the receipts and to go back to the goldsmith to get the gold. So people started trading receipts. And the goldsmith figured out what was going on. And so he started making up some receipts and he started trading them around. And so what would happen in a case like that, when people figured out what the goldsmith was doing, they would go back and demand their gold back. So a run on the goldsmith was really a bad thing for the goldsmith. Well, the goldsmith became the modern banking system of today. As we could see, we can go through all the history of our country. We could see how gold and silver was used as money in the early stages of our country. And in fact, when we get to the founding of the nation, the first central bank went into existence in, I think it was 1791. Hamilton was the treasurer, and George Washington signed it in to being. And they had the whiskey rebellion. They put a tax on whiskey in order to pay for some of the things in the central bank. So you can Google any of this stuff you want to. Just put in whiskey rebellion or central banks, and all this stuff will come up. And Congress basically controlled the money at this point. Lincoln drove through something called the Legal Tender Act, and Congress had the power to control things like the amount of currency that was in circulation, the interest rates, all these things Congress controlled. And Congress basically played politics with all that stuff. And we had banks fail all the time as a result of this. And I'm skipping over a lot of stuff. I'm trying to do this quickly. But when you get into 1907, there was a banker's panic. And in that banker's panic, the trust banks were in trouble and they began to crash. The Knickerbocker Bank was one of them. And when these banks crashed, government had to step in and try to stop the bleeding. J.P. Morgan played a role in working with the government to stop it. And so people cried out for change. They wanted change. And Woodrow Wilson campaigned on reforming the banking system. And you had a lot of banks fail between the end of the Civil War going up to 1907. So, I mean, the average lifespan of a bank during this time was 5 years. So, and this is all researched out. I have all the notes and everything in the book. You can go and click on the links and figure all this stuff out. You can Google it. It'll come right up. So what happened was they started the Federal Reserve in 1913, and the IRS was created to go along with the Federal Reserve. In the 1920s, we went into the Roaring '20s. And there was money that was added to the supply. And when you get to the end of the decade there, around 1929, under Hoover, we entered the Great Depression. And the Great Depression started by a stock market crash. And these banks started to call in these loans from these people. And they were margin loans. A margin loan, basically, whenever a bank would demand that you pay the loan, you had to pay it off. And so the banks started calling in all these margin loans, and that caused the crash of the stock market. Well, Hoover was one of these guys that liked to tinker with things, and he thought he could fix it. So one of the things he did is he limited tariffs as a way of providing American jobs. So all that did was limit global commerce. It had more harm than good, really. And then he put taxes on various things like rubber and other things, and that drove the cost up for people. So his solutions weren't very good. The Federal Reserve was afraid of deflation, so they began to withdraw currency out of the money supply. It's over $1 billion they took out. And back then, that was a lot of money to take out of the currency supply, okay? So once the Federal Reserve started to take this currency out, people had to rely on gold and trade in gold. And people began to hoard gold. And so it locked up the entire economy. And there we are in the Great Depression. That's how it all came about. So FDR is elected to come in and fix all of this. And it is FDR that removes us from the gold standard. It was not Richard Nixon. Everybody says Richard Nixon removed us from the gold standard. That fits into a conspiracy theory narrative. One of the things that these guys say that when they sell these investments is that Nixon removed us from the gold standard. That's not true. Nixon stopped something called Bretton Woods, and it's called the Nixon shock. Just Google the Nixon shock and it'll come up. So after FDR removed us from the gold standard, he put out an executive order. It was in May that everybody had to turn in their gold. If you had gold certificates or if you had gold coins, you had to turn them in. And they basically took all the gold from the American people, and it became illegal to pay off your debt using gold. So we left the gold standard then, and then the Federal Reserve started to kick out more currency. Now, what's interesting to note here is that during this time, 33, 34, and 35, those were 3 years of banking reform, 3 years of banking laws that were passed to reform the whole entire institution. So a lot of these conspiracy theorists will demonize the Federal Reserve of 1913, but at 1935, that bank was no longer around. The whole Federal Reserve was rewritten. You have the ESF, and you have the way everything was distributed through them, and how it was a controlling arm for the Federal Reserve. If you go in and you can download all this stuff and look at all this different legislation from back then. That's what I did when I was researching the book. I went and got the Federal Reserve bill and some of the other bills and just looked at them and had to keep toothpicks, keep my eyes open. They're the most boring things, but you learn a lot of stuff from that. And one of the things I've learned is all these things that these guys that were saying that sell gold, silver, or foreign currencies, or some of these other investment scams, they just did a total rewrite of history. And they need that rewrite to make you think there's a problem with the dollar, because if there's a problem with the dollar, then you want to invest in something else. So usually when the dollar goes down, gold goes up. And when gold goes down, it's because the dollar has gone up. That's typically how it works. Sometimes, in rare occasions, the dollar and the gold will either go up or down together, but that's very rare. So what they need you to do is to believe that a dollar crash is coming, and if a dollar crash is coming, then you're going to run and buy gold, or you're going to buy a newsletter to keep you informed of what's going on. And so there's all these different scams that are out there if there's a dollar crash. And so
let me just stop you for a second, because I want everybody to understand you're not saying that selling precious metals is a scam.
No.
Because if I'm not mistaken, you have precious metals yourself.
Right. I have a good supply of precious metals, and I don't believe that buying gold or buying silver is a scam at all. But
I just want to make sure people understood that.
Oh yeah. But if you're buying gold or silver because you think the world is going to end and the entire global economy is going to collapse, chances are you're going to over leverage, and you're buying gold and silver for the wrong reason. There's a lot of things they say. Like, for example, they'll say China's buying gold. and they're doing it to boost their central bank. Well, when you get in there and you look, you discover that China is importing gold, but because they're the number one export manufacturing base in the world, a lot of that gold is going for manufacturing. Now, China does back up at least 1% of its currency with gold, and it's been expanding. So as their currency grows, they do add gold to their central bank reserves, 1%. But China has over $1 trillion US dollars in their central bank to back the renminbi. Now, the Chinese currency, they have two names for their currency. One is renminbi, the other one is yuan, Y-U-A-N, right? Is that right? Yeah. So they have two names for their currency, and it's backed by American dollars. So the chances of them, or the chances of any of these other nations abandoning the dollar, is slim, because you have 145 countries around the world that have dollars in their central bank. And if that dollar were to crash, the whole system goes. It's not just America. All these other nations fall too. So as time went on, we get out of the Great Depression, America starts collecting gold. And it's not until the end of World War II where we see the next major change, because in World War II, they signed on, while the war was going on, they signed on to something called this Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, it's named after Bretton Woods, which is a hotel in New Hampshire. And these leaders from 44 nations around the world met at this hotel to sign onto an agreement that's a new global commerce agreement. And that's when we get the International Monetary Fund. That is when we get the IBRED, which is an international bank. And then we have GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, which later on became the World Trade Organization. So all these global entities arose after World War II. And then what happened after that, we had the Marshall Plan. Now, the Marshall Plan was unique because it went into these nations, and it was named after what I think, is it George Marshall? I'm trying to remember from 12 years. Right. Trying to remember from 12 years ago. So George Marshall basically was a Secretary of State, and the plan was named after him, and it was the plan to rebuild Europe. So they'd go in and they'd rebuild Europe, and all of these guys would have to sign on to these global entities. They would have to surrender a certain portion of sovereignty to the IMF and to the international banking and all this stuff. So this is when you see the global government arrive and arise, but it really has no serious teeth yet. So all these nations are being rebuilt, and what they did is they kept dollars in their central bank. And throughout the course of this, the way it worked was we had most of the gold because FDR confiscated all this gold. We had, I forget the exact number, but it was like 20,000 tons of gold. Current amount of gold in the world is somewhere between 35 tons, 34 to 40 tons, maybe somewhere in there. It's been a while since I've seen
34,000 tons.
34,000 tons, yeah. So that's the total amount of gold that is in the world. So we had 20,000 tons. So basically what they did is they kept our dollars in their central bank, and then we had gold. And then they could always remit their currency for the gold that we had in our possession. But because we had the majority of the gold, that backed the dollar, basically. And it didn't float. The currency rate for the dollar didn't float. It was a solid exchange rate. So what happened was we went into the 1960s and we started spending money. And during the Vietnam War, right? The space
war
race,
on poverty.
Yeah, the Cold War, the war on poverty, all these things started to add up. And all these nations looked and seen America has more dollars than they have gold. They're printing all these dollars. They're accumulating this debt, just like the goldsmiths did way back when. And so they wanted the gold. They wanted to trade in the American currencies they had in their central banks for the gold. And when they started to trade this in, they started to dole out some of the gold that they had. Then Richard Nixon came to office, and what he did is he ended Bretton Woods. He ended that Bretton Woods agreement as far as paying the gold for he stopped the trading, and it was supposed to be temporary, but it turned out to be permanent. And today, what we have left is 8,133 tons of gold is what America has left. Now, with all that gold, we still have more gold than any nation in the world, and it's divided up into 4 locations. Fort Knox is one, but it's divided up in 4 other locations. So now these nations don't have anything they can use to get their gold back. They're kind of out of luck. So in the 1970s, the Yom Kippur War happened, and during the Yom Kippur War, um, the Arabs were mad that the United States resupplied Israel. And so what they did is they did an oil embargo. And this is when, in the 1970s, we experienced something called the energy crisis. The news media wouldn't tell us what was really going on. All they said during the time, I remember because I grew up during that era, I remember that they said we were running out of oil, we were running out of natural resources. That was on the nightly news every night. When the truth of the matter was, there was an oil embargo against America, and it was the Arab nations and OPEC that had this oil embargo because they were mad about us resupplying Israel. So in 1973, talks broke out with Saudi Arabia. And in 1974, June 8th, the Petrodollar Agreement was signed. So what is the Petrodollar Agreement? Now, the agreement doesn't say petrodollar. It's on the agreement. It's like Saudi Arabia military and economic agreement. You have to put that in a search engine to come up with the actual agreement. About 12 years ago, I found it and I read through it when I was doing the research. So I wrote about the petrodollar about 12 years ago. And this is the agreement in a nutshell. Basically, Saudi Arabia sells us oil only using US dollars. In exchange for that, then the United States supplied Saudi Arabia with weapons, and they supplied them with military hardware. And they said they would defend Saudi Arabia. And all they had to do is sell in dollars. Now, Saudi Arabia also has to, according to this agreement, take 12% of what they make in the oil and buy bonds. So they have to buy the bonds at a reduced rate, but 12% of their profits go to buy American debt. So if you think about this, okay, there's 3 things that happened for the United States. It increased global demand for the dollars, it increased global demand for U.S. debt securities, and it gives the United States the ability to buy oil with a currency it can print at will. Okay, so if you're a nation, let's say you're a nation like China, or you're a nation like Japan, at that time Japan, and you don't have any oil in your country and you want oil, you can take your currency and exchange it for US dollars and go buy your oil that way. Or what you could do is you could build a Datsun, or you can make a Nintendo, or you can make any kind of good, import it into the United States, take the money you make from that, and then go buy your oil. So the side disadvantage of the petrodollar agreement is that's the exact time when jobs began to leave America and they began to be exported in other countries because of this petrodollar agreement. Okay, so I remember growing up, and the first jobs to leave were the textile industries. And in 77, 78, they had commercials. Look for the union label when you were buying a coat, hat, or glove. Some of you from the era might remember that. That's because all those jobs are going overseas. It accelerated in the 80s and accelerated in the 90s. And then when Clinton left office, he got China on board with the World Trade Organization. And that's when jobs really began to leave. That's when we really began to suffer in our manufacturing base. Okay, so this petrodollar created global demand for the dollar in such a way that 2/3 of our currency, our physical currency, is exported overseas and used overseas. A lot of the people who say we have all this money that we're printing, or this money that the Federal Reserve has printed, well, all of that money is overseas. A lot of it is overseas. Then we have about 2/3 roughly. In the 1990s, there was a man by the name of Harvey Bernard, and he came up with an economic platform of how currency should work. And he called his system the National Economic Security and Reformation Act. The acronym is NESIRA, and that's what it was called. So he tried to present this to Congress. He tried to get Congress to buy into this. And the only one that would see him is Ron Paul. And Ron Paul was pretty dismissive with him. He didn't buy into any of this stuff. So in desperation, what he did is he put this thing on the internet. Now, when he
in the early days of the internet,
in the early towards the end of the 1990s, right? So when he did that, there was a gal by the name of Shania Goodwin, and she took NESIRA and ran with it. Now, she claimed that the act was actually passed with additional provisions. And she also claims that George Bush and the Supreme Court have kept it hidden. But Clinton basically signed it before he left office, is what she says. So she's called the Dove of Oneness because she went to a school, New Age school, the Ramatha School of Enlightenment. Now, this is the same school that Shirley MacLaine went to, you know. So she put all this Hindu thought in this stuff. So she took this NESIRA stuff and she blended it with scams that were on the internet, the dinar being one of them, but another one called Omega Trust, and another one called CMKX Diamonds, which is something that happened in Canada. So she took this NESIRA thing and blended it in with all of this stuff. And people began to look at this and believe her. And they basically supported her, sending her money and donations and that kind of stuff. But she was absolutely Looney Tunes. She came up with the white hats and all this kind of stuff. These were people that were going to, military people that were going to enforce this NESIRA thing. When Bernard found out about it in 2005, right before he died, he was mad and he tried to go after her. But then he soon passed away after that. Well, then we had
This was all before the QAnon craziness.
Oh, yeah.
And QAnon kind of absorbed some of these concepts into,
Yeah. So what happened was that we had the 2008 meltdown, and that supercharged the NESIRA movement. And it's totally conspiracy all the way through. And all the Hindu stuff in it was really bizarre, I think. But once this became supercharged, we had certain terms that we learned that came out of this. Like, for example, the term global currency reset. You can Google that. Right. That came from NESIRA. This whole
prosperity packages. Remember that? Right. Everybody's going to get their prosperity packages when they redistribute the wealth throughout the world. And it's going to reset the global economy to where we don't have any more poverty. And it was just a bunch of garbage.
It was a bunch of lies. Yeah, a nation is going to base their currency on their resources, which was really dumb. If you know anything about how economics work, nations don't take oil and base their currency on their oil supplies. The currencies are secured with other types of things. Okay, but the whole thing was a lie. They rewrote history. And they made all these talking points. Now, when I wrote my book, the reason why I included the petrodollar is because the petrodollar was an argument against what they were trying to preach. And it basically, that book sold in 24 countries around the world. And people took that stuff and started using it as talking points. So it basically stopped once people figured out about the petrodollar. It stopped any kind of nonsense with this kind of scam. And these are points that gold and silver people use to sell their wares. Like I said earlier, I have gold, I have silver. I'm not opposed to that. But if you think the world is going to end, gold and silver is not going to help you.
Or the dollar is going to crash overnight.
Right. That's not gold.
That's a big selling feature.
Yeah, it's a big selling feature. And the petrodollar goes against the narrative of the dollar crashing. Okay. So basically what happened was they would come against the petrodollar and they would predict the dollar's crash. So the dollar's crash has been predicted. It's still predicted today. It's been predicted for the last 20 to 25 years by these people, because if they can make you afraid that the dollar is going to crash, then they can get you to buy into their investments. And that's exactly what they do. And so these investments, the reason why I went so hard after them is because they target Christians. And what they do is you call in to invest something, they'll purposely put you on hold while Christian music plays in the background. That's designed to lower your defenses, but you don't trust anybody just because they have a fish on the back of their card. Okay.
Right.
You have to really scrutinize everything here. And so what happened was they would always come against this petrodollar thing because they knew that was the main argument that brought strength to the dollar. Because the dollar is in big demand because of the petrodollar. Well, if you look at the news in the last year, China's been doing some things with this whole deal with Saudi Arabia because we protect Saudi Arabia with our military. Okay, so what happens is that Saudi Arabia, one of their enemies is Iran. Iran and Saudi Arabia don't get along. Iran does not like the way Saudi Arabia is run as a country, and they don't think they're radical enough from a religious perspective. Okay.
Aren't they from two different branches of Islam?
Yes, that's true too. So they don't like each other to begin with, and so there's conflict.
And the Saudis are led by a monarchy, and Iran's run by the Islamic clergy.
Right.
So they believe that Saudi Arabia should be run by the clergy instead of the king.
Right. So in order for the petrodollar to go away, they would have to do something about Iran, and they would forfeit their military support if they started selling oil in any other currency. But what's interesting to me is that people attack the petrodollar in Saudi Arabia. They don't realize that all these other oil nations signed up for the same thing. They know a good deal when they see it. So all of OPEC is on this petrodollar agreement. It's not just Saudi Arabia. And Kuwait also signed on to the petrodollar agreement. That's why we had to go to war when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, because
I remember at the time, I remember telling people, we didn't go over there because they were our friends, because the Bush administration, Bush Sr. was saying, our friends in Kuwait have been overtaken by a ruthless dictator, and we have to go in and defend our friends. It had nothing to do with them being our friends, because Kuwait voted with the Soviet Union a lot at the United Nations.
Right.
But there was a military strategic thing in play there.
Right. And, the thing about all that is, if we did not honor the petrodollar agreement, if we stayed out of Iraq, then all these other nations would see, hey, that military support isn't worth anything. Why are we selling it in dollars? We had to go in there to protect the petrodollar agreement. And then what did we do after that? We left Saddam alone and we left, right? Well, then years later, we're dealing with this guy and he's causing some kind of conflict. I remember weapons of mass destruction and all this other stuff that the media put out there. Well, Saddam decides, because of the restrictions of commerce and the sanctions, he decides, well, I'm just going to start selling oil in euros. And he starts selling oil in euros. And all of a sudden, we are making invasion of plans. We are planning to go in there and take care of him. And right after he started selling it in euros, we went into Iraq and we set up the Iraqi government. Another good example of this is Gaddafi. Gaddafi was floating something called a gold dinar, and he wanted to get rid of the petrodollar system. So he was trying to get all these Arab nations to sign on to this gold dinar thing. And he was touring around everywhere. And then what did Barack Obama say at the time? Gaddafi's got to go. Gaddafi's got to go. He never said why Gaddafi's got to go, but it was because of that petrodollar agreement, and they took care of Gaddafi. They got him out of the way. America protects that petrodollar agreement. They really do. And it's a very serious thing for them. And that was the source of
so over the last couple of, I hate to cut you off here, but to get to the point really that I wanted to address here, over the past couple of weeks, we've been reading a lot of stuff on the web about Saudi Arabia is ending the petrodollar agreement.
Right.
And everything you've said now has led up to that. So tell us what you know about that.
Well, first of all, they don't say that Saudi Arabia is ending it. They say the agreement is going to expire. And the agreement doesn't ever expire. Now, Saudi Arabia can decide to sell in any currency they want, but they get the best deal from the United States. So they sell their currency using the dollar, and that creates demand for the dollar globally. But there is no expiration date on the petrodollar system, and all these other nations still use the petrodollar system. So it's not just Saudi Arabia. What a lot of this is these same investment kind of people wanting to come against the petrodollar so that they can drive fear, so that they can get you to buy into whatever it is they're selling. And it's not just gold and silver. There are people who sell financial newsletters, and they put themselves off as being some sort of financial investment expert, and buy their newsletter, and they'll keep you abreast of what's going on. So a lot of those guys, they push this demise of the petrodollar, because the dollar's not going to go anywhere until the petrodollar ends. It's just the way it is. And so a lot of this conspiracy theory against the petrodollar system is designed to get you to invest in certain investments, and that's why that fear mongering is there. But it's not going to happen. What has happened, when I was digging into this today, and this is the first time I've looked at this stuff in 12 years. So when I was digging into this today, I discovered that the Biden administration, I'll call up my notes here real quick. The Biden administration has been in talks with Saudi Arabia, and they're looking at a new agreement called the Strategic Alliance Agreement. You can Google that to figure out what's really going on. And in the exchange for the U.S. Commitment to help defend Saudi Arabia if it were attacked, the draft treaty would grant Washington access to Saudi territory and airspace to protect U.S. interests and regional partners. It is also intended to bind Riyadh closer to Washington by prohibiting China from building bases in the kingdom or pursuing security cooperation with Riyadh. So this is part of a wider package, which is going to be attached to this, is that they're going to allow Saudi Arabia to have nuclear reactors for nuclear power for the people. And it's also a step towards establishing Palestine as a state. This is also tied into this agreement. And it also, the Biden administration is also saying they're going to end the war in Gaza. Now, these are all the things they're including in this strategic alliance agreement. So out of this thing of people saying that the petrodollar is going to end is because it'd be replaced with this strategic alliance agreement. Now, nothing is set in stone yet. I mean, they're still negotiating this. It's still up in the air. We don't know. But Saudi Arabia is not going to abandon the dollar. As in fact, none of these nations are going to abandon the dollar for several reasons. First, all of these nations, when they signed on to the agreement, they have to buy 12% of U.S. debt. Okay, so they buy these bonds, and they get these bonds, and they've been buying these bonds for years. What happens if the dollar fails? What happens to all the bonds that they have? What happens to all the dollars they have? I told you China has over $1 trillion in its central bank. All the central banks, 145 banks around the world in various countries, have dollars in their central bank to back their currency. If the dollar becomes worthless overnight, then all of their currencies become worthless because their currencies are backed by the dollar.
A whole global economic system crashes.
The whole thing comes tumbling down. And I strongly doubt that's going to happen, because within this monetary system, for those who are into this kind of prophecy, this biblical prophecy, the mark of the beast is built into this system. You know, you see these articles within the last year, I've seen them, where the Federal Reserve is going towards a digital currency. And it's a little bit misleading because the currency is already a digital currency. Every time you run your credit card, you just did a digital transaction. Anytime you use the currency at all, mainly people use digital transactions. It's already digital. What they're really talking about is more like a blockchain, like cryptocurrencies. Okay, so because they want to compete with Bitcoin. So the whole idea is to put out a blockchain currency to compete with other cryptocurrencies, but still have the digital currency system they currently have in place. I don't think that's a good thing. And by the way, I am not an apologist for the Federal Reserve. I'm not a fan of the Federal Reserve, but I think it's important that we get our facts straight. There's a lot of demonization of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, there was a reason that we had to go off the gold standard,
Right.
and that because there was not enough gold to go around,
No, there wasn't.
and they needed to be able to expand and contract the money supply, and you couldn't do that on the gold standard. So, and as long as they were on the gold standard, like you said, we were going to have
Right.
just ongoing bank failures. It was
Right.
a banking crisis
Right.
that has been pretty much eliminated by use of the fiat currency system. Fiat
Right.
meaning it's named
Right.
a certain.
Fiat is basically a fiat currency is a currency established as money by a governing regulation or a law. Okay, it is established in the sense or order of a decree. Okay, so basically, if it has no value outside of that law or that decree, where they say well, gold was never a fiat currency. Well, that's because gold has value outside of the use of money. Okay, so the law is pretty strong. All debts, public and private. That's fiat currency. Okay, so it's all money declared by the government to be legal tender is fiat currency. Okay, so that's pretty substantial.
But fiat doesn't mean that the money is backed by that the dollar is backed by nothing. We've got debt instruments, we've got gold, and we got the faith in the system, which is a major asset.
Well, let me run you down a list of what these guys say. Okay, these scammers, they'll say this: the dollar is vilified as an evil fiat currency. Okay, the dollar is backed by nothing. They'll tell you that. The dollar will collapse because it is overprinted, which I think is laughable. Nixon removed us from the gold standard, which Nixon didn't. FDR did. The Federal Reserve prints too much money, inflating the money supply. Well, here's the thing. The Federal Reserve does not print money. And in fact, it doesn't have one printing press for printing money. Our physical money is made by the United States Treasury. That's a fact. And it's distributed through the Federal Reserve. Okay. The dollar is inflated by the feds because they print too much currency. And this is why all inflation happens. Inflation is not just caused by the dollar being printed and put into the currency supply. That's one cause of inflation, but they will make you think that's the only cause because they use things like inflating the currency. Okay, and they use that term. Let's see what else. The Federal Reserve is a private institution. The Federal Reserve Act was passed while members of Congress were away on Christmas break. That's pretty crazy. No one knew about the Federal Reserve. All this stuff, if you go in and see the history, I got it all in the book. And I can, in the back of the book, the last chapter are just, if you buy the ebook version, are just links you can click on to debunk all of this stuff. And all this stuff is there to make you think that the dollar is not stable at all. It's amazing that the dollar survived the 2008 meltdown. I think that was pretty substantial for the dollar to still remain the standard and go through something like that is pretty outstanding, I think. So the dollar's not backed by nothing. Okay, first of all, we have the 8,133 tons of gold in possession of the Treasury. Okay, so and the Federal Reserve makes a profit every year of about $40 billion, 40, 50, somewhere in there, and it's the only institution that funds itself. And that money is remitted back to the Treasury. So even though the Treasury is paying interest, that interest now, okay, these numbers, I should say, are back about 10 years ago, because this is when I was looking at these numbers. But about 10 years ago, 40, 50 billion a year was remitted back to the United States Treasury from the Federal Reserve. Now, it's private in the sense that control is taken away from Washington. Congress doesn't control a lot of the stuff that the Federal Reserve was controlling. This was the big debate. It was the Federal Reserve legislation was debated for 4 months on the House. Okay, and because these guys were giving up power and they didn't want to do it, they were losing
checks and balances.
Right, they were losing control over the interest rate. They were losing control over the expansion and contraction of the money supply. All these different factors that that determine how currency functions. Congress was losing that and putting that in a central bank. So you had a
So
lot
it's
of
not true. It's not true that the Rothschilds own the Federal Reserve.
No, that's not true at all. That's not true at all. The Federal Reserve is a government institution. And in fact, you have oversight committees, and 2 members of Congress sit on the committee for the Federal Reserve. It's not something that's functions on its own. And the president appoints the chairman. So it's a government-run institution, and the top dog in our financial is the Treasury. Then you have the ESF, which is the controlling arm of the Federal Reserve. The whole thing was restructured in 33, 34, and 35. So all these guys that demonize the Federal Reserve, they demonize the Federal Reserve from 1913. Now, like I said, I'm not a fan
no
of
longer exists.
Which yeah, it's totally rewritten. The Fed is still there, but the legislation is a different animal. Okay, so I'm not an apologist for the Federal Reserve, but I think we need to get it right. If you have issues with the Federal Reserve and you have problems, you're ignoring the real problems, because all the stuff you're bringing against it, conspiracy theories, people look at that and say, well, this isn't true. They're probably wrong in these other areas. This is why truth matters.
We need to wrap it up here, because my camera's going to die here in a minute. Okay. But I just wanted to sum up. Neither Trump nor Biden is interested in ending the petrodollar agreement, or system.
Right.
Saudi Arabia really isn't interested in ending the petrodollar system. Correct.
Right. That's absolutely correct.
Right.
In fact,
Go ahead.
In fact, they're negotiating a better deal.
Better deal.
Yeah.
Right. That wouldn't end the petrodollar agreement. It would just strengthen it.
Right.
So what Marcus and I have discovered over the years is that the Christian community is the target of a lot of investment scams and a lot of lies. And that's why, remember Jesus said, be wise as serpent and harmless as doves. Don't just believe, like Marcus said, just because somebody's got a Christian sign on their business card. Don't just trust people who claim that, this is the system, this is the blessing that, God's going to use this investment to make us all rich and transfer the wealth from the ungodly to the godly. We've heard all of this stuff. And it's just investment scammers, guys. Be very careful about infinity scams, investment scams. Don't abandon common sense. Get good books on investing. Get educated about currency valuation. And don't invest in something that you don't understand, because that's when you're going to be vulnerable to scammers. God wants us to be good stewards with our dollars. And based on everything that Marcus and I have come across, yes, the dollar will eventually lose its status as the world reserve currency. But the whole system, like we said, would collapse if the dollar collapsed overnight. This is going to have to be a slow process of the dollar losing its power globally. It just can't crash overnight without the whole system coming down overnight. And then we'll all be killing each other for food. Nobody wants that. So don't invest by fear, and always fact check people. And like I said, don't abandon common sense. Marcus, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, actually, I have some scriptures I'd like to read to you, and this is from the HCSB version. And the first and most important one is in 2 Timothy 1:7. It says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." So if you have the spirit of fear, what don't you have? A sound mind. Okay, and here's some other scriptures I'm going to. Proverbs 12:11. "The one who works his land will have plenty of food, but whoever chases fantasies lacks sense. The wicked desire what evil men have, but the root of the righteous produces fruit." Proverbs 13:11. "Wealth obtained by fraud will dwindle, but whoever earns it through labor will multiply it." Proverbs 16:8. "Better a little with righteousness than great income with injustice."
Amen. That's good. Don't fall for get rich quick schemes. If it sounds too good to be true, guess what? Probably is.
Right.
And if it sounds horrible, and if it's putting fear in you, just be aware that it could very well be a scam. It's just a means to promote a scam because
Mhm.
fear sells.
Right.
So-
Proverbs 28:25. A greedy person provokes conflict, but whoever trusts in the Lord will prosper.
Amen. Okay, well, we're going to have to wrap it up. But thanks, Marcus, for sharing all this information. If you want Marcus's book, it's available on just pretty much anywhere that Amazon or Smashwords.
You can get the iBook, you can get Barnes and Noble, you can get the ebook version is on all the ebook outlets. The physical copies you can get at Amazon, so you can get it from there.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Rod and Staff podcast. God bless.